Welcome to Trump's America, the podcast that dives into everything that got us here and has us all living in Trump's America. I'm your host, Mick Larson. This week's topic is white Christian nationalism. Breaking that down is my guest this week, David W. Congdon. He's a senior editor at the University Press of Kansas and an instructor at the University of Kansas and McCormick Theological Seminary. He is the author of Who is the True Christian? Contesting Religious Identity in American Culture, published in 2024 by Cambridge University Press. All right, let's do this. Well, David, welcome to the podcast. Is there anything in particular that got you interested in the subject of white Christian nationalism? What drew you to it?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I began my journey in this topic for a couple reasons. One is I grew up within an American evangelical home. I was kind of deeply surrounded by a lot of these themes. I went to seminary, did my PhD in theology, and I ended up doing my research on German religion and politics, especially in the World War II period. My original dissertation and my early scholarship was on theologians in that period who resisted the Nazis. And I wanted to explore the theological roots of that resistance. I didn't intend ever to talk about Christian nationalism or especially about the United States and their situation today. But it led me there recently. I was fired from a position at a Christian organization shortly after Trump's first election, and I published a book at that time that had angered people in the evangelical community. And
the name of that book?
That book was called "The God Who Saves: A Dogmatic Sketch." It was a book specifically about issues of salvation, and I argued that all people are saved, all people are recipients of God's grace, and all those things. And that was a challenge to certainly evangelical attempts to partition people into us versus them, the insiders and the outsiders. And I also had made some political remarks in that book as well. This was, of course, shortly after the Supreme Court authorized same-sex marriage nationally. That was a hot topic at that time, a really divisive issue for the community at that moment. And I had pretty clear, allegiances to that on that position in the affirmative. So it was just a very tense moment. And after that loss of my job, I had to change careers, but at least change jobs, change states. Came down to a red state here in Missouri, and I began to find myself surrounded by people and contexts that forced me to ask questions about the United States and the American historical situation that we were in. And that led me to talk and research more about this topic.
Before we move on to, white Christian nationalism here in the U.S., I'm curious, it's a whole podcast in itself, I'm sure, talk about how the German theologians grounded their resistance in theology, but how did they do that in a nutshell, I guess?
The ones I was looking at did so specifically by rejecting the attempt by the Nazi theologians, the pro-Nazi theologians, to connect God with the German nation. And so the way they resisted that was to argue for God being utterly transcendent, beyond culture, beyond our politics. And in that sense, unable to be tied to one particular culture, one particular nation. So the otherness of God was really crucial for them in that context.
So present day, how would you define, I guess, let's say historically and present day, how would you define white Christian nationalism?
It's a good question. I think that's a challenge for scholars because this term is fairly new as a single term like that. I would say it's an effort to enshrine a certain it's an effort to enshrine a certain vision of Christian political life in the governmental national life of the nation. It's complicated to kind of phrase this, right? Because it's not straightforwardly a political program or a theological program. It's a complex meshing of these two. There are certainly some white Christian nationalists who are simply white nationalists with a veneer of Christianity, right? And so in that sense, it's not much different from KKK white supremacy visions of the nation. And there is certainly an antecedent and historical trajectory there, right? There are, however, other white Christian nationalists for whom the theological vision of the church is crucial for their understanding of what the nation should become. And so in that sense, they begin with a vision of Christianity that they then want to, authorize, legalize, force upon the national government and its various political institutions. It's hard to parse those out, right? And so in some ways, the term white Christian nationalism collapses those two different trajectories under a single umbrella. And that makes it a not always adequate fit to the reality on the ground. And so for that reason, I hedge a little bit in terms of how to define it. Essentially, it's an authorization of white nationalism, and it's marrying with that a vision of the church and Christianity that is imperial, is authoritarian in nature. So maybe the long story short, it's a vision of God and country in which God and country are melded together into a larger vision of the country and the nation as a whole, that lifts up a certain approach to white, a vision of white America as being a superior and normative vision for the country.
So, so basically, God and country becomes one in this scenario.
It is. I mean, it's a version of theocracy. I think theocracy would have been the term that we would use if we had been talking about this, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. That's the language and terminology that was more in vogue at the time. Christian nationalism, especially white Christian nationalism, has only really been a popular term for 8 years, since 2016, really, since Trump's election, first election. And so we're sort of fumbling around a bit here for language to help us understand this phenomenon.
Did this movement develop over time? Was it around when North America was settled? Was it called different things or have different labels?
I mean, I actually think it began in the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago.
Right.
I think we have to trace it back to that point. The Reformation, for those who maybe are not fully up to speed on their religious history, that's a movement, of course, in which people broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in Europe, started new denominations, what we now call denominations, new traditions, Lutheranism and Calvinism in particular. And the conflicts between Lutherans and Catholics, which were often very violent conflicts, and they were supported by different local princes and government imperial rulers, eventually led to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. And that decision in the Peace of Augsburg set up a principle. In Latin, it's cuius regio, eius religio, which is whoever's realm, their religion. So basically, whatever ruler was in charge of that region, they got to choose what the religion was for their area.
Yeah, what the state religion would be.
Exactly. And everyone in that state, everyone in that region had to convert. If you had a period of time in which you could either convert or you could leave. You could go to a different country, go to a different area of the empire. And that's essentially the birthplace of the modern nation state. And so in that period of time, religion and state, of course, are completely intertwined. Later on, we have the Peace of Westphalia, which brings in Calvinism as a third option. But I really do think that if you're going to look at the history of Christian nationalism, you have to start there to understand what it is that today's Christian nationalists are really wanting. They want to go back to that. That's the vision. It's Christian Europe. Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people realize that the Catholic Church ran all the governmental agencies before there were governmental agencies, whether it be education and everything. And so obviously when that split happened and further on time, it's like the nation state was a brand new thing.
It was, right. And I think one of the things that today's Christian nationalists like to criticize is the way that those institutions became secularized, became part of a state apparatus that was neutral with respect to religion. For them, that is in many ways the fall of humanity, right? This secularization of government
Hmm.
agencies. For them, that's the problem when we need to go reverse that.
Were the settlements in North America, obviously they're very religious, different kinds of religion. Was that also an offshoot of that coming over from Europe?
Certainly the Puritans and the early colonial period of the United States, or pre-United States, right? The colonial period of America
Mm.
was very much influenced by this Christian nationalism, this European Christian nationalism. And I think you have to understand a lot of the early roots of the American experiment are rooted in that nationalist identity of the nation, that the religious identity of the nation. Um, it's when you read the framers and founders of the United States, of course, however, like Madison, Adams, Jefferson, it's a very different story. They are appalled by Christian nationalism in Europe. They explicitly reference the rules and regulations about heresy in Europe. Jefferson and Adams in particular are, talk about how horrible it is that people are getting their tongues ripped out for writing about heresy. And they explicitly want a constitutional framework that's going to reject Christian nationalism. And so you do have this twin kind of contradiction within the American experiment of these Puritan Christian nationalist roots, along with a constitutional framework that is anti-Christian nationalism. And that tension is certainly sort of borne out through American history. That's the tension with which we all live.
And I've never heard anyone talk about it, but what was the argument and how much tension was there when they were putting together the Constitution and leaving God out of it between the white nationalists or,
Yeah, and there really wasn't as much debate at that point, I think, in large part because the people who were involved in those decisions were shaped by certain philosophical influences of the Enlightenment. A lot of them were deists, a lot of them were influenced by Scottish Enlightenment ideas that made it so that, I mean, that issue certainly was debated, but it wasn't the central problem. That wasn't the issue they were trying to deal with. I think a lot of the remnants of that early Puritanism had lost their centrality and power when they were framing the United States at that period. Um, there was, of course, an undercurrent all the way through. I mean, for a long time, for almost a century, you have these effort to kind of fix the Constitution in order to enshrine Christianity within the Constitution. So there's virtually a century-long effort to make that happen. And so conservative Christians in the United States were very much aware that their Constitution did not reflect Christianity. That was widely understood. That didn't really end until Eisenhower's election. And when that happens, Eisenhower really is the period in American history when Christian symbolism and language becomes culturally normative, culturally widespread, as being part of what it means to be in government.
America.
You need
Okay.
to espouse the pieties of Christianity and religion in order to be recognized as an American leader.
I know you've touched on it, but what are some of the theological or ideological beliefs of the movement?
This gets at the problem of which aspect of the movement we're talking about, but I would say one of the core ones would have to be language of sovereignty. Sovereignty is this concept that goes back, of course, early Middle Ages, but it's this idea that one, that God is the sovereign, so God has this ultimate omnipotent rule and authority and power. And then there's a reflection of that same sovereignty in the ruler that God authorizes, that God raises up to be in charge. And so whether that's the king in the medieval period, or for Christian nationalists today, a president or some supreme leader of the nation, there's a strong emphasis on sovereignty as being a crucial feature here, that the people need to be obedient and subservient to a leader who's going to be the moral voice of the nation, who's going to be the spokesperson for the divine will over the people, right? So that's a key theme we see come up again and again. There's another sense of purity. I think there's ideas of purity are sort of baked into religion forever, but within the kind of Christian nationalist worldview and ideology, there's a strong concern for purifying the body politic, for expelling influences and people, right,
Right.
who are
Ideas.
and ideas, right,
Yeah.
that are going to contaminate and sully the nation, right? So you have in white nationalism, like just pure white nationalist rhetoric. This is, of course, comes into the issue of anti-immigrant policy and just broadly anti-Semitism, racist views about the people being polluted by foreign blood, right? That kind of whole
Mhm.
language that was crucial to Nazi Germany, crucial to South Africa and apartheid, crucial to Jim Crow and other places. Um, but then the Christian aspect to that is then it adds a layer of orthodoxy to it, right? So part of what makes Christianity, especially in its more authoritarian elements, makes it distinctive is this strong emphasis on expelling the heretic, expelling the blasphemer, the person who is going to pollute the purity of the Christian church or the purity of the Christian community. And so if you combine that with these ascriptive labels that, whether it's race and gender, or sexuality and other things, you very quickly you see how these things fit together. Expelling the heretic also becomes expelling the gay, expelling the immigrant, expelling whoever it might be. Those people become the heretics for a Christian nation.
Have those tenets evolved at all over time, or is this pretty much the way it's always been?
It certainly has evolved. I mean, the qualities or the characteristics of the other that needs to be expelled has changed certainly over time. And so has who has been in charge of this movement. If you look at 150 years ago, the Christian nationalists at that time were what we would today call kind of the mainline Protestant church leaders, the main Presbyterians and Anglicans and Baptists and others who were um, seeking to create a more Christian America. At that time, the quote unquote evangelicals were on the more progressive side of things. So the evangelical movement in the 19th century was often characterized by an effort to push for more progressive legislation. Abolitionism being the most prominent, but you have other things at that time that were really widespread. That, of course, switches. It flip-flops in the early 20th century with the fundamentalist movement and the modernist movement. And we don't need to go into the details there, but it's definitely evolved. Who has been in charge of trying to push for Christian America and what's been the motivation for that Christian America? Those things have changed quite a bit over the years.
Um, when did they become a real factor in American politics, or were they always a major factor in American politics?
I I don't think you can say they become a really major factor until um, probably the mid 20th century. I do think Eisenhower is crucial here in terms of uh, giving them a place and a platform to really shape policy at the federal level. Um, it's not just Eisenhower, certainly, and you can certainly see much earlier influences here. But I think that's where the breakdown between the acceptance that the government should be is a place where those principles and beliefs should not be codified into law or put into made nationally binding. That starts to break down there. It's not coincidental that that's also the same time in which you see Christian institutions begin to flourish that become more of a political force. So Christianity Today, the magazine, is founded in 1956. That's right in the same period. You know, you have Under God put into the Pledge of Allegiance in 54. You have the National Prayer Breakfast established in 53. These are all part of Eisenhower's kind of period and legacy. So the National Prayer Breakfast is that secretive group called the Family that they meet, you know, annually for this event. And so a lot of these groups, institutions, and mouthpieces begin to really mobilize in the mid 20th century. And you see that influence gradually take, you know, greater and greater form over the years after that.
Do you see this, especially in the context of the 50s, more of a political movement or a religious movement, or both, I guess?
I don't really distinguish that, you know, because I think that it's hard to, you know, I don't really think there is an apolitical religion in that sense. You know, religion is always kind of embedded and deeply connected to politics in some fashion, even if unintentional and implicit. So, but in terms of being explicitly political, it certainly is. I mean, the evangelical organizations that start in the late 40s and early 50s, they are actively lobbying Washington from the start. You know, so the National Association of Evangelicals, the NAE, that begins in this period, they are very much lobbying government to support missionaries around the world, to, you know, spread quote unquote religious freedom. That's part of their agenda. So politics is already baked in. That isn't new, really, from that period. We have to, if you go back earlier, you look at the temperance movement, right? That's also a
Sure.
Christian, you know, Christian movement to affect politics. And if you go back earlier than that, I do think if you look at the Civil War period, you know, the pro-Confederacy Christians in that period, you know, one of the things that they did, one of the really important aspects of their rhetoric in that period was to say they were the only ones being apolitical, non-political, because for them, slavery was just part of what it means to be a human being. A human society they've always had slaves, you know, and that's just part of the natural order of things, right? And so the only one who was engaging in politics, from their perspective, were the abolitionists. They were the ones who were, you know, distorting Christianity by bringing these political influences into the picture, whereas the enslaving Christians, were apolitical. They were holding on to pure biblical Christianity. You see slaves in the Bible. Slavery is just part of the human order, all those things. So now, of course, we would recognize that that's nonsense. They were just as political as their opponents. But the rhetoric of what counts as political and what counts as apolitical is itself, you know, motivated by politics, right? And so that's a deeply political conversation.
And the irony is that the only U.S. Constitution that had God in it is the Confederate States of America Constitution.
Right. Very much, for sure. Yep.
That's funny to say they weren't being political.
Yes.
in that context. How does this movement intersect with other far right ideologies, and where might it diverge?
Um, I, let me, I mean, it's complicated. Okay, so globally, if you're talking about globally far right,
well, no, just here in the U.S.
I have to think about that a little bit. I'm sorry.
Well, and let me, like you said before, it's like it's hard to separate white nationalism from white Christian nationalism. I guess talk about, it's like, you know, which came first? Did it even matter what came first? And, you know, who's riding on who's, you know, back on this?
I don't know if those can be separated. You know, if you look at the Klan, for instance, it is very much a theological and Christian movement. You know, they claim Christianity throughout. They claim the Bible. They also claim the Constitution. You know, they claim to be, you know, restoring the true Constitution and all that. So it's both political and religious at the same time, and trying to parse out what counts as religion, what counts as political, is sort of an impossible task.
Sure.
I think on that question, trying to isolate those is going to be not only impossible, but probably actually hinders our ability to understand those movements, right? So um, I'm not sure, I'm not sure if there's a way to how much to compare other far right movements just because of the cross-pollination that exists throughout in these different efforts. Not everyone who we might call a white Christian nationalist would themselves identify as a white Christian nationalist, right? And so there's a difficulty here in terms of what do the kind of scholarly outsiders identify as part of this movement versus what do insiders to that movement identify with. If you want to dig down deeper, you have to sort of break out the Christian nationalist movement into these various subsets. So you have things like the New Apostolic Reformation movement, which is a very charismatic Pentecostal Christian network of people who um, are not necessarily all that politically involved, um, but they are deeply tied into these networks of Christian leadership that are listening to these self-described prophets who are making these claims about God and Trump and the nation. And so, for them, they're looking at Trump, and if they're listening to these prophets, for them, it's all religion all the way down, right? It's God,
Hmm.
Trump is God's prophet, God's emissary to restore kingdom of God and bring about this age of reformation and renewal, right? It's all religion. So, if you were to press them on political questions, it's probably a non-starter, right? That's not
Right,
what
right.
they're
That's
not
not what
thinking in
they're
those
interested
terms.
in. Yeah.
Right. But the implications of this movement, of course, are very political, and have massive political implications for the rest of society.
Well, that brings me to the next question is what kind of influence has the movement had on the past few elections, especially, 2016 through the one we just had here in 2024?
Yeah, it's been fascinating and troubling, I think, for me to watch, to see the influence. It's um I don't I think we have to, it certainly is earlier than that. And we have to look at the George W. Bush administration and the rise of evangelical leaders into prominence there politically. Uh, I think um, I think what we see over the last 20, 30 years is um, various efforts to figure out how do we win? How do we gain power in
Yeah.
this country? I think a lot of evangelical leaders thought maybe Bush was going to be that way to gain that power, and it didn't pan out that way. So and there are various reasons for that, but I think the experience of Bush, and then especially the experience of Obama, and led to a deeper sense of militancy on their part in an effort to basically do whatever they needed to do to win. Um, and so you certainly see a disregard for the old issues of morality and the old moral majority kind of ideas. That just went away because that was impeding what they needed to do. They needed to get a lion into the White House in order to destroy the old structures and rebuild things anew. Um, and Trump provided that for them. So yeah, it's had a major influence. What's been interesting about this situation, though, and Christian nationalism more recently, is the I mean, I think that one of the stories here is the lack of influence of the old Christian right thinkers and speakers and leaders. A lot of the old guard of the Christian right leaders who were more influential in, say, the 90s and early 2000s, were many of them were anti-Trump and advised their followers and their churches to not support Trump. Those people in those churches did not listen to them, didn't care what they had to say, and went their own way. And so one of the one of the larger effects of Christian nationalism today is really the death and the loss of these old institutions and their power, and the arising of new networks, both of communication and of institutional power, that are harder to figure out. They don't follow the old rubrics and the old standards for how things get done. I think that's the influence of the internet age, it's the influence of social media, right? It's also the decline of churches in general. I think one of the really interesting storylines here about Christian nationalism is how few Christian nationalists actually go to church, actually belong to a church. Now, a lot of them do go to a church, certainly, but that's not important anymore. We actually
Hmm.
saw an increase of people who identified as evangelical, but a decrease in people who actually went to church on Sundays. And um, uh, now that doesn't correlate there. I mean, even so, the most religious that weren't more progressive. They were just as much pro-Trump. But what we're seeing is a lot of people joining what they viewed as evangelicalism because they saw it as a broad political label for what it means to be, a MAGA pro-Trump, you know, supporter. And so the institutions of Christianity are in flux. And so denominations are no longer all that relevant. And the new structures of power are still in formation. And we're not entirely sure what that's going to look like.
So I've always thought of evangelicals as a separate category from white Christian nationalists. So am I wrong about that? And tell me how that actually is playing out in real time now.
How to define an evangelical is even more complicated than how to define a white Christian nationalist. Uh, I don't think those two are separate, really. I mean, you're on the right. You're making a good point here about the label, because certainly the label of evangelical is larger than the label of white Christian nationalist. There
Right.
are anti-Trump evangelicals. We saw an Evangelicals for Harris campaign that had support. Um, that being said, uh, what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years is some more clarity about what it means to be evangelical. I think for a long time, people thought evangelical just meant somebody who had certain convictions about, the Bible, about, God, and other kind of religious theological identity markers. Um, Most scholars today would say that's not the case. What defines an evangelical are the networks that you belong to, the people that you're listening to, who you follow, who you respect, who you are taking your orders from, so to speak. And uh, what that means is that really an evangelical, it has always been tied up with Christian nationalism. Um, who those leaders are have changed, certainly. So we've seen a shift from, say, somebody like Billy Graham, to somebody like Lance Wallnau, and other kind of these new prophetic NAR and Christian right thinkers who are espousing a very different vision of what it means to be Christian in America. I think
Do you
both of
do
I
you
think
would
both
you
of the,
include
go ahead.
Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk, that flavor, or is that the smaller?
Turning Point is I don't know if I would characterize that as an evangelical uh you know wing. I mean,
Okay,
it's very much explicitly a political
gotcha.
movement.
Action group,
Um
basically. Yeah.
yeah, it's a group. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I certainly think that it is deeply tied into evangelicalism in the US, but I would separate those out in terms of who their audiences are and what their motivations are. Um, that being said, of course, a lot of these groups, institutions are partnering with each other and working together to advance their agenda. So again, there's no clean break here between the political and the religious, but you do have different organizations, different groups, emphasizing different kinds of rhetoric, and that those rhetorical differences matter, even if the political conclusion in the end is the same.
Can you kind of take us through the evolution from Billy Graham to today and how the message has kind of changed based on the leaders of the evangelical movement?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, Billy Graham's version of evangelicalism, which was dominant from 60s to the 90s, I would say roughly. Um, I mean, Graham's vision is one of conversion, right? He's trying to convert the nation, trying to win people over for Christ. Uh, so it is a vision of Christian nationalism, the Christian nation. He wants a Christian America. Um, he
But
certainly thinks that. Oh,
But
go
it
ahead.
doesn't seem like he's, to me, looking back on it, seems like a moderate figure, that would meet with any president, obviously.
Sure.
Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I mean, it doesn't seem like he was like, hey, we got to make this a Christian country, uh, and change the Constitution. I
It's
don't know
true.
if that's true or not,
Right.
but that's a
Um,
feeling I get.
I think he's less moderate than I think the public perception of him
Okay.
probably is.
Hmm.
Um, but you're right. I mean, certainly compared to some of the figures we're seeing today, Billy Graham's vision is quite a bit more moderate. That being said, that is also true for the right wing of the nation as a whole, right? I think
Hmm.
if you look at somebody like Nixon versus somebody like Trump, there might be similar megalomaniac tendencies, but their policies are radically different in
Yes,
terms of
radically different.
what they want to achieve. So I think there's also just a change in what's expedient, what's possible within a political order. For somebody like Graham, you know, Graham has a very constrained vision of what he thinks is possible, what he wants to achieve. He just wants to get people to accept Jesus Christ as their savior, and in his mind, in his view, the rest will follow. They'll have the correct moral, political beliefs as a consequence of their conversion. That's a vision of evangelicalism that was very prominent at that time. I think what happens, especially post the 90s, the 90s come along. Reagan's revolution did not have the effect that a lot of evangelicals hoped it would regarding abortion and other issues. And Clinton gets elected. They get they start to despair a little bit about whether or not they're ever going to achieve their ideals. And so when Bush comes along, I do think you start to see a big shift away from conversion, away from these big crusades to evangelize the population. That's no longer the route to achieve their ends. Instead, with Bush coming into power, they realize they need to actually work the mechanisms of government. They need to get their conservative policies into the White House and use those mechanisms and levers to transform society at the structural level, irrespective of whether or not people align with Christianity on a personal spiritual level.
Um, why did they choose the Republican Party to do this?
uh, Racism. I mean, that's probably the short answer. I think when you have the political realignment that happens post the Civil Rights Act and post LBJ and all that, you
The Southern
certainly
strategy, yeah.
Southern strategy, all those things. There is um, but certainly by that point, a strong alignment of the white South with the Republican Party that, of course, has remained in place since. I think there's other things going on there too. One of the things about the Republican Party, post Reconstruction, the Republican Party has been the home for corporate leaders, business leaders. And if you look at histories of evangelicalism in America, um, there's a huge influence by corporate America, business leaders being, in many ways, the ones who are manipulating and controlling the levers of evangelicalism. And that goes back to really the 19th century with the oil barons, and then you see this later on in the early 20th century with a lot of the business leaders being the one to kind of mobilize the evangelical movement and the fundamentalist movement. So um, business interests are crucial to the Republican Party and have been ever since Reconstruction. And then you add on the element of race and opposition to progressive civil rights legislation. You see a very clear messaging here: pro-business, anti-civil rights equality. Republican Party then fits that very nicely.
You touch on this, but I think it's very interesting, if not ironic, that in the 1970s, evangelicals were looking for political leaders that modeled, what they wanted in a leader, modeled their values. Um, I would say for the most part, the Republican Party probably took advantage of them and, paid them lip service, and they got no results whatsoever, which you've touched on. And I wonder if all that happened, you said they changed their strategy, and that's how they get in bed with Trump, because before that time they were like a Jimmy Carter would be their kind of guy, except he was in the wrong party. But he was an evangelical, and he tried to live his life as an evangelical. Um, so what are your thoughts on that, where they just dropped their, I don't know, Christian values and just went for power? And that's what I see is like, we've dropped our Christian values. Now we're into power and getting to the levers of power.
Talking about Christian values is tricky because I don't want to attribute
Well,
like
it's a certain kind of Christian value. I mean, there's
right.
obviously
Yes,
conservative, there's a conservative Jesus and there's a liberal
there
Jesus
is.
in
Yes.
our body politic. So I know what you're saying
Yeah,
exactly.
no, it's tricky. I mean, it's tough. I don't want to say that they're being disingenuous about appealing to certain values of, love and goodwill towards all those kind of those traditional values. Um, but if you take an idea like um, you know, even just an idea of love of neighbor, right? Let's take a simple Christian value like that. Um, Love of neighbor can mean very different things based on the content you fill in. Like, what kind of love are we talking about? What kind of neighbor are we talking about, right? So, today's Christian nationalists still would talk about love of neighbor. In fact, they talk about it all the time. It's one of their key mottos. For them, though, it's crucial. Your neighbor is a person who looks like you, right? That only somebody who looks like you, who fits your ascriptive qualities and characteristics counts as a neighbor. So, fellow white Americans are white Christian neighbors, or are the neighbors of white Christianity. So they'll talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan all the time. For them, they love this parable. For them, it's a parable of Christian nationalism, of Christian America. We should take care of, of the person who is our real neighbor. Our real neighbor is somebody like us. And so it's tough to have these conversations about Christian values because the content of these values is being
Very
redefined
subjective, yeah.
all the time. And so you can see a through line where the same values are being espoused, the same sermons are being given, the same biblical passages are being referenced, same theologies are being espoused and taught, but the interpretations are night and day, are radically different. And this goes to a larger point that it's theology and religious values and religious convictions are not the driver of politics and probably never have been. The driver, it's actually the reverse. Your religious views are being driven by your political convictions and so a political scientist, Michelle Margolis, has written about this in her book, From the Pulpit to the Pews. Sorry, I think that's correct if I get the title right. But when she makes this argument very clearly about how you can see where people's religious convictions are shaped by the political views that they held at a certain point in their life, and that plays out in terms of which church they end up going to as an adult and all the rest. So it makes for a very difficult situation here where you can't rely on a preacher or pastor to say, to preach a different message about, love of neighbor and all the rest, and assume that that's going to translate into policies that are more welcoming of the immigrants and more, affirming of, issues of race and gender, sexuality, and the rest doesn't translate because they're being filled with different content through other means.
So how do you explain that transition from we want to elect political leaders that espouse our values or culture, what have you, to Trump, who is obviously not very religious at all, you know?
Oh, I think he actually does represent their values and their
Okay.
traditions. Actually, very.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think he really does. I think it's a mistake, for a lot of scholars made this mistake of thinking that Trump was this confusing aberration where this person who was obviously not Christian, right, is this idea. Um, that's just not the case. He actually fits their vision of Christianity quite well, and it's because their vision of Christianity has been deeply authoritarian for a long time. They've been fed a diet of this kind of what we might call kind of a far right purity culture for decades, in which the goal of of Christianity, and the goal of their version of Christian America is to exclude the other, exclude those who don't fit their idea of what the normative American should be and look like. That's fundamentally what Trump's message has always been. Kick them out, right? Deport them.
Yeah.
That's
Build
his
a
vision
wall.
of the country. Build the wall, right? That's what attracts these evangelical Christians, because that is exactly their vision of Christianity. Get rid of the heretic, expel the blasphemer, expel the person who doesn't believe the same doctrines and views and ideas that you believe. So it lines up perfectly.
And just to clarify, if they could change the Constitution and add God and whatever they wanted to say religiously, would they do that?
I think a lot of them probably would, but one of the things that's really changed recently is the how people view the Constitution itself. This is complicated. So on the one hand, earlier I gave this narrative about how the Christian Constitution movement sort of died with Eisenhower, and that's partly because starting with Eisenhower on, you have this kind of almost cultic worship of the Constitution as being this grand creed of America. The Constitution becomes worshipped really as this incredible document given to us by God. Really, it's a miracle, right? And so Constitution worship didn't really exist until then. Now we've lived with it, our whole lives and beyond. What's happened though more recently is there are a number of these far-right Christian nationalist figures who are anti-Constitution, and who actually want to get rid of the Constitution and establish a whole new one, right? So the Constitution worship is no longer a clearly conservative ideal. In many ways, actually, the liberals and Democrats are the more clearly the type to worship the Constitution today, right? And so that's a very interesting reversal of these roles. You listen to somebody like Kamala Harris or Biden or other people, they'll praise Constitution up and down. This is this amazing document that establishes these liberties and democracy and all the rest. And that's true. In their vision, that's what the Constitution is. And for a lot of the far-right movement today, that's exactly the problem with the Constitution, is that it has too many liberties in there. It has too many equalities and freedoms in there that are inhibiting their agenda of establishing a more authoritarian government, a more right-wing Christian authority in the nation. So certain things like the First Amendment even are a hindrance to the vision of the nation they want. This is not true for all Christian nationalists, certainly. There are some who still worship the Constitution in their own way. But there is this deep strand now of anti-constitutionalism that we see. And I think especially among people like J.D. Vance. Vance belongs to a network of people who are called the post-liberals. The post-liberal network, people like Adrian Vermeule at Harvard, Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame. These are Catholic leaders who explicitly blame the Constitution, the Enlightenment, kind of early modernity as the problem that they want to overcome. And they want to overcome it by writing a new constitution, by getting rid of the original liberal democracy that enshrined the United States at its origins and establishing a new religious state. And so I think for somebody like Vance, he's listening to people who are anti-Constitution.
What part does patriarchy play in this movement?
I mean, it's baked in all the way through. There's a lot to say about that topic. Kristen Cobus-Dumais, of course, and others have been the leaders in clarifying that influence of kind of the American masculinity and the patriarchy. It's I think it's a crucial in the sense that it has funded a vision of male headship and male leadership and a certain vision of the family at the base level of the Christian church, right? So American Christianity has been kind of formed and shaped by a certain understanding of what the family ought to look like. And that has then certainly had a long-term effect in shaping the kind of policies that they approve. Their ideas about marriage equality, their visions about abortion, and other big cultural topics. Um, so it's had a huge effect. It's all the way through. It's tied in with a lot of the militaristic rhetoric also that is very crucial here. So this idea of having a strong man in charge that the president should represent. It's kind of patriarchal father figure, who's going to punish his wayward children who are, straying from the moral law, all these things. It's all there in their rhetoric, and it certainly informs the policies they want to put in place.
I always like to ask the question, what came first, patriarchy or religion? At this
Yeah,
point, which is holding which up?
yeah, that's a chicken and egg question for sure.
What about civil rights and gay rights in this movement?
I think you can say that the Christian right movement, Christian nationalist movement as a whole, is an anti-civil rights movement. That is uh, core to that entire way of thinking. I mean, the anti-civil rights movement uh, is really an important, maybe the most important aspect of today's right-wing politics. So you see that going back to, when Clarence Thomas replaced Thurgood Marshall in the Supreme Court, right? And so there's a really good book by Mike Collins that just came out from the University Press of Kansas called The Anti-Civil Rights Movement. I had the chance to work on that book at the press, and it tells that story of the very complicated networks of power and communication that arose to basically erode civil rights legislation to find ways to tear it down. We've seen that more recently in the anti-affirmative action decisions from the Supreme Court. That's, one more effort to get rid of these planks of civil rights that were established in the 60s and 70s. CDC is also in the voting rights evisceration that occurred, with the Roberts Court. So lots of these efforts, and of course, issues of marriage and sexuality are also part of that. We very well may see an attempt by the current Supreme Court to reverse Obergefell, and that's probably going to come our way in the next few years, almost certainly. And there's going to be a lot more beyond that, possibly about contraception, going back even many decades earlier. Who knows? The end effect of this new administration is it's impossible to say right now, but could be very widespread and long lasting.
As a society, do we need to counter the influence of white Christian nationalism?
I certainly think so. It's how to counter it is going to be the real challenge, especially given how embedded these views are now in government and in positions of power. It's hard to say how this is going to play out. I think one thing that we can look to is actually an early history of states' rights, actually. So states' rights arguments back in the 19th century were actually progressive in nature. You had a federal government in that period that was a much more conservative government. And so at the state level governments that wanted to enshrine more progressive policies did so in their state constitutions when they were formed, but then also at state level political decisions that were made. We might be now seeing a return to that.
Certainly.
Governor Newsom in California just established a discussion to open up talks about how to make California resistant to the new Trump administration. We're probably going to see more of that occur in these more solidly blue states. So in the government level, that might be one strategy, is to create these sort of safe haven states where these kinds of policies can be resisted at the state level. Um, I do think, it's going to be tough to see what we can do on the very local level, the micro level. It used to be the case that churches did a lot of that work. You look at the sanctuary movement by churches in the Southwest, where they would house migrants who were being deported or being rounded up. That goes back to the 80s. And unfortunately, those churches are no longer, well, a lot of them are no longer around. So it's going to be interesting to see how people respond to Christian nationalist policies at this level when we're living in a society where we don't have the same public structures and community organizing structures that we used to have a half century ago.
Yep.
And so it's harder now to figure out how to mobilize and how to create local protections for people. That's going to be a big challenge, I think, in the years to come, is to figure out how to make that happen, how to rebuild those community structures.
How militant do you see white Christian nationalism? Is that a concern?
Yeah, it's a militant movement, for sure. I mean, I think if we've learned anything from recent years, it's they are increasingly willing to do whatever whatever is necessary in their view to achieve their ends. And the violence of their rhetoric has only gotten more extreme. So I do think that we should expect to see militancy at that level. I don't know what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
It's a real question in terms of what plays out here in terms of, does Trump mobilize the military to punish his political enemies, right? That's something he's said he was going to do.
Right.
Carrying that out could be, who knows? It could be very, very disastrous.
Actually, just the idea of deporting millions of people.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's a massive political operation. You look at something like, Operation Wetback, which is this horribly racist policy back from the 50s. Again, under Eisenhower, right? That's an Eisenhower policy, was to deport these Mexican immigrants, Latin American immigrants from that period. Yeah, we could see something like that again. You could see another version of some of those Eisenhower policies happen now, which would be quite the undertaking. And, it might be the kind of thing that mobilizes more progressive Christians to figure out how to protect people from the government, which is an interesting reversal here. How do
Right.
more liberal progressive types actually develop an anti-government network of a coalition? We're living in an unprecedented situation here in terms of how this might play out.
Yeah, that's a total flip of conservatives and liberal,
Right.
action. Um, Last couple of questions. What would a white nationalist America look like? I mean, you obviously touched on it, but I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think where I think it's realistically going to go would certainly be a repeal of most of the progressive legislation, most of the progressive Supreme Court decisions that have been passed over the last 20, 30 years. So that seems like a fairly safe bet. I think we should expect to see an abortion ban come through fairly soon. If Poland is any indication, Poland, when they took control of the government, all the aspects of government were controlled by the Christian right in Poland, and what they did right away was create an abortion ban, right? And Poland also created what they called these LGBTQ free zones, basically where gay people couldn't exist, queer people couldn't live, and it was like half the country was that in Poland, and I think you could see half the United States become explicitly anti-queer, anti-LGBTQ, where to be out at all is criminalized.
Right.
That's not far-fetched at all. So, we could expect to see that happen. I think those are almost for sure going to be the case. I think,
And obviously
yeah,
gay marriage would be overturned, like you
sure,
said.
that would be overturned for sure. I mean, there's a lot of those decisions that'll all be probably taken down over the next, next couple of years. Could be even the next 6 months. Who knows? I mean, it's really hard to say how fast and how militantly they want to enforce their vision of America.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how, they want to bring back the Comstock
Yep.
laws and get rid of birth
Yes.
control, which, seems crazy, but that's where they're going with this.
I, it is. I mean, it is crazy, but I don't know. Yeah, you're right. The Comstock laws could certainly come into play here. Uh, yes, I think. Um,
Yeah, we're
yeah,
we're
yeah.
talking Handmaid's Tale here. That's what we're talking.
It'll be interesting to see if
Unfortunately.
it is. Yeah, it's very unfortunate. It's very scary. We'll see what happens if states resist, and then if the federal government, is deployed to push back against those states, then we're getting to, quasi civil war territory here. I mean, don't want that to happen at the same time, but also, the conflict here between the two different Americas that we currently live in is so stark, so
Yeah.
strong that it's hard to know how to avoid some of those outcomes.
Well, and we just had an election as we record this 2 days ago.
Yes.
And so obviously America had a very clear choice on which direction they wanted to go. Talk to me about, especially in the context of white nationalism, talk to me about what America chose to do for the next 4 years in your eyes as you
Yeah.
analyze it.
I mean, on the surface, it's very clear that most Americans chose Trump. They wanted Trump, and uh, that it wasn't as if you can't say that about 2016, where maybe some people just didn't really quite understand what he might do. Well, we know what he did, and we know what he wants to do. It's very clear. That being said, I it's hard to know the motivations of people. I think a lot of people, you know, I think one of the mistakes that a lot of liberals and leftists make is the assumption that people vote based on a clear, articulated philosophy of government, this clear principles and policies that they want to see enacted. I don't think most people vote uh, on that basis. Um, I think most people vote in their pure self-interest in terms of what they personally want for themselves, right? What seems easiest for them. So we saw a lot of, like Missouri, where I live, passed abortion protection. So we have abortion rights protected in the state of Missouri constitutionally, and they passed a minimum wage raise and a protection for just and protection of sick leave being mandated. So employers have to provide sick leave.
All progressive issues.
Progressive points. At the same time, elected Republicans across the board, all the way down the ballot, all Republicans. What do you make of that? I make of that people want things that are tangible. What Trump promises people is quick, easy fixes that will make their lives magically better and not require anything of them in terms of having to endure differences with other people, having to, he promises this magical reality in which prices go down and people look just like you, and all these really comforting things. And even if it's completely fed by lies and misinformation, they hear the easy message, and that just sounds really nice, especially if you just don't like, how things were for whatever reason, recently. So so I don't think most of the votes were motivated by Christian nationalism. I think a lot of votes were, certainly. You saw 81% of white evangelicals vote for Trump again.
Again.
That's the same number all the way through, right? 2016, 2020, it's always been about 81%. So no change there. They have been a rock solid, steady vote for Trump. And so that's been the case. The thing about evangelicals, though, is that they're a declining percentage of the population.
Yeah.
Evangelicalism keeps shrinking year after year. Fewer and fewer people identify as an evangelical. So their steadiness of their vote can't explain Trump's election. You have to look at other forces, like the Latino vote, like the Black vote, like other areas where, especially by men, right,
Yeah.
where we saw a shift. And so I think there are other factors involved besides Christianity.
Do you think it's fair to say that people vote their values?
Insofar as most people's values are egocentric, yes. I think,
Well, it's like
I,
well, I mean, it's simple to me. It's not that complicated, but
yeah,
if you value women's rights and equality, there's an
yeah,
obvious party to vote for
yeah,
or not vote for.
yeah.
If you value gay rights, civil rights, there's a party to vote for. So I don't know if this is fair of me to say, but I'm saying it's like I think people vote their values. At the end of the day, I don't know what else you know
Yep.
what commentary are you going to say about that?
I think one of the mistakes that liberals make is they lump in abortion rights with other civil rights legislation. I think the big difference there is, you know, I, as a straight male, me voting for queer rights and for immigrant rights is something where I am voting for on behalf of others, right? On behalf
Mhm.
of what I want for people who are different from me. Abortion rights can be much more self-focused for the vast majority of the population, whether it's me wanting my girlfriend to be able to not have not be carry a child to term if they don't want to, or if my spouse or my girlfriend, whoever, wanting they want their own personal freedoms in that regard. That doesn't require much in terms of being willing to think of the needs of other people who are different from myself, right? And
Right.
so it ends up becoming an outlier in terms of the voting. So I think a lot of Democrats were hoping that having abortion on the ballot would lead to more Democratic votes elsewhere on the
Sure.
voting, and that just doesn't materialize that way.
And rightfully so to think that, because obviously since Dobbs, Democrats have done well every 2 years since Dobbs. So I
Yeah,
was of the belief too that that was going to take us over the finish line, but
yeah.
uh, obviously it did not.
I think it's
La-
also, the thing about these elections is we have to remember these larger social things. COVID happened in 2020. Without COVID, probably would not have had a Biden presidency.
you're right.
These
You're right.
larger social events that completely changed perceptions about Trump at that period of time. Without the 2008 recession, I don't know if we would have had Obama as president. You
Yeah.
know,
If Bush, I agree with that. And also, if he would not invaded Iraq, we probably
yes.
wouldn't have Obama. I just think George was so unpopular and everyone wanted change. And you look back now and you go, how did Obama ever get elected? You
The
know?
thing about the thing about Iraq, though, is that, I mean, Iraq was in 2003, and Bush won handily in 2004, right? And so,
Right.
that wasn't
But after that time, things
sure,
got a
things
little
got
more
worse.
real.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, that's true. I think, I do think the war in Iraq was motivating for people on the left, but I think the recession motivated people more
Sure.
generally.
No, I would agree.
Pocketbooks
Of course.
affect
He,
people, and that gets people to vote. People vote on their money, how much money they have in their bank account. And um, yeah,
yeah. Well, it's the economy, stupid, right?
it often is. Even if in this case here with this election, the economy is actually doing very well, And so here it's the economy stupid plus misinformation stupid, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
it's propaganda about a supposedly bad economy that worked. It got a lot of people fired up, even if objectively speaking, the economy is actually doing quite well. And
It's a,
we sailed through an inflation period quite more successfully than maybe we could have otherwise.
well, and our rebound as an economy is the best in the whole world post
Right,
COVID. I
right,
mean, so, but
yeah,
I understand. at the local level where people are tired of the price of gas and eggs, I get that, but it's like relative, but you're asking a lot of people to think hard to say, hey, relative to the rest of the world,
Right.
you're lucky you live in the United States. But
It's true.
Last question. How is your, I mean, this is not a religious podcast, but it's always interesting since you do teach at a seminary, and you obviously went to seminary. How has your religious journey changed you, or how have your views gone in that journey that you've been on?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey for me. I mean, I grew up deeply within American evangelicalism. Yeah, my family networks are tied in with people like Billy Graham and others, So I would say I went to seminary myself as somebody who was, when I went to seminary, I was making my exit from evangelicalism. And I started making that exit because of the Iraq War, because of Bush's policies there in that period. And so I went to seminary in 2005, right? This is right after he had been reelected. And so my journey has been kind of under that umbrella of, being an ex-evangelical, and trying to find a more capacious, more encompassing, inclusive vision of Christianity. That didn't pan out well for me. I was fired from two different churches and then fired again from a Christian organization. Steadily pushed further and further out until, more or less I became sort of a, religiously disaffiliated after all that.
Did you become one of the nuns?
I did. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in a sense, I think I still,
in a sense, yeah.
I still identify broadly as Christian just because of, I still care about Christianity. I still teach and write for, Christians and for larger Christian student audiences. But I feel on the outskirts. I'm an outsider to, most Christian circles these days. And so it's a struggle for me to figure out sometimes where I belong, where I fit. I do hope that what I do in my teaching and my writing can benefit people within the church, within Christianity, to move those institutions, move their churches in a direction that will hopefully have a more positive outcome for the nation and for the world. But ultimately, I don't know if Christianity in America can be rescued, to be frank, and there are just too many forces at work that have entrenched a certain understanding of what it means to be Christian in this country that makes it very difficult to know what the future holds for Christianity here.
Well, David, thanks for sharing your story and thanks for sharing your expertise and knowledge with me and everybody else. So I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You betcha. I again want to thank David for helping me break down this important and dangerous movement that is white Christian nationalism. I hope you learned as much as I did from the conversation. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Have a great week and take care.